Welcome GRD132, Typography 1, and what I'm going to do in this video is try to go over Chapter 3 of our Exploring Typography book. Now this is Chapter 3 of the Exploring Typography book as we see it in Cengage when we're on the web. It starts out fine, starts talking about type styles and fonts and things like that, and then it digs into the classifications, and it gets really complicated because it shows all different styles, it shows many sub-styles, and it gets a little confusing. And then there's pages and pages of fonts, which probably, if you're not familiar with them, they're just going to be confusing and they're all going to look the same. So I just want to point out something. I know that when we go to My Fonts, we see just basic categories of fonts. Sans serif, slab serif, serif, display, which I use the term decorative, but you could use the term display font as well. And then handwritten and script, I kind of put together in just the script category. So that leaves us 5 categories. Now in the chapter, it goes over much more than that. So I just wanted to guide you through a little bit because it is a confusing chapter if you're new to typography, and it doesn't need to be. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. So I made a PDF, and you're going to be able to download the PDF, but I'm just going to run through the PDF right now because what I did is take screenshots of these classification categories here where they have some of the details and then some samples, and I'm just going to go over that really quick, hopefully to guide you through this a little bit easier than just reading it through the book. Now they start off with black letter, and all of these things kind of start out in 1455 with Gutenberg's movable type, the invention of movable type. So this is talking about actual type that's being used on a printing press. And this black letter type was based on German scribes, and in some cases even Celtic scribes as well. So that's how you'll see fonts that have this kind of style. It's sometimes referred to as Old English, sometimes referred to as Gothic, sometimes referred to as black letter. And here they say Gothic and Celtic, and it also says highly decorative. Now that means even though it can almost be like a handwritten font because it's made by scribes, we pretty much put it in the decorative category, and in the 21st century, we're going to use these fonts as decorative fonts. You might see them on college diplomas, you might see them on certificates, you might see them on formal legal documents, you might see them for like a German fest or an Irish fest or something like that, or restaurants and things like that, but you're not going to see them in everyday body copy. You're not going to see them on websites very much, so they're not a category that we're going to focus a lot on, but I wanted to bring it up first because that's the first thing that they address in the chapter, and also historically that was the first typeface. It kind of led into the Roman typefaces, so these were kind of the German Celtic kind of black letter Gothic. If you think of, Gothic, goth, you think of dark. Well, that was the blackface fonts because they were very heavy. There wasn't a lot of white space in them. They gradually started to become lighter, and there was even like a category of white letter fonts, but they started off very heavy, and you're going to see a lot of those fonts in this category. But as we start moving on to serif fonts, I guess we'll just call them serif fonts. The first serif fonts that we're going to look at is kind of an old style. Now, typically you'll see serif fonts broken down in 2 categories. Old style and modern. Now, in here, in this book, they'll even show you more categories. The first one is Humanist. Now, first of all, just think of Humanist as more organic, more handwriting-like. That's one way to think of it. It has more human forms. It's less clinical, precise. It'll be more like handwriting. I guess that's one way to think of it. And the first category is really just an old style. I would never ask you the difference between necessarily to identify Humanist versus old style. They also call these Venetian because it was kind of Italian based when they started. I think they mentioned Humanist Venetian. But anyway, one thing I just want to point out about these fonts, and one of the fonts I've seen, in Adobe Illustrator and things like that, is Jensen. You might have heard of the font Jensen. You might even have heard of Stempel and Souvenir. And Souvenir is a font that was popular like in the 80s and 90s, and people don't use it that much anymore. It's kind of out of fashion right now as a serif font, but that was kind of in that style because they had the E's have this kind of diagonal crossbar. If you zoom in here and look at the E, you could see they have a diagonal, and that's the only thing that really differentiates them very much from the old style font. So I'm not going to mention too much about the Humanist other than they were Venetian, they were the first ones, and the term Humanist, whether it relates to serif fonts or sans serif fonts, is more organic. There'll be more handwriting type shapes involved. You'll see more contours. It'll look less like it was, machinery created it, I guess, if that's a way to kind of look at it. So moving on from here, we have old style. And in old style, you'll see a lot of familiar fonts. You'll see a Caslon, Gaudi, Garamond, Times New Roman, and sometimes you'll see names in front of them like Adobe because these are revival fonts. They were redone. They were original fonts done hundreds of years ago, but they were redone, by Adobe and different type foundries that kind of bring back styles. Just like you could have styles of beer from the 1500s in Germany and they bring them back now. It's the same kind of thing with fonts. And they're common fonts, and the kind of serif fonts you'll see the most. Caslon, Gaudi, Garamond, Times New Roman, you'll see Palatino. There's different ones you'll see in here, but these are the old style fonts. They're very much like the Humanist. They typically have the descender like in H's that rise a little bit above the cap height, and their crossbar in the letter E is usually horizontal going across. So that's all you have to know about that, but this is pretty much the most common font that you'll see in serif fonts is the old style font. You'll see that in a lot of body copy, in a lot of books and textbooks and novels and formal papers and things like that. Times New Roman you see in research papers and resumes. So that's the old style font. So that's kind of the main category. Don't worry about Humanist too much. Just consider Humanist a part of old style. Now, the next is transitional, and again, this isn't a category I focus on a lot. I don't talk a lot about transitional typefaces. I don't categorize them, but they were kind of the bridge between the old style and the modern. So they're a little bit more precise, a little bit more clinical, meaning they're a little less humanist. They're a little less handwritten. You'll see less organic shapes in the letters. Now, one of the things you'll see in these, in Baskerville and New Caledonia, those are two examples I picked out from the book, is that their beaks. And if you remember, we talked about beaks and barbs and things like that. They actually have beaks and barbs on their C's, both on the top, on the outside and inside. They both have double beaks, which are almost symmetrical, both here and here. Think of like a horseshoe. That's the way the C's are in here. Now, that doesn't mean all transitional typefaces have C's like that, but the ones I'm pointing out here that you might have heard of Baskerville. You'll see that even in our web fonts and Gravit, we have a Baskerville version. So you can check these out, some of these characteristics here, but it says more precise than old style. That's all you really need to know. But I probably would not ask you about transitional versus old style. I'll just say old style and modern. So that brings us to the next category, which again is a subcategory of serif. Remember, these are all serifs that we're talking about, not the black letter, but all of these so far. The Humanist, the old style, the transitional, and finally the modern. They're all serif fonts. And what you'll see with modern fonts is really high contrast between their lines. Now, Bodoni could almost look like the one we just looked at, Baskerville, a little bit. It has the same kind of beaks and barbs on the letter C, but what you'll see is real high contrast between the strokes, between the main stroke and the secondary stroke. Very thin lines, and these fonts don't work well at small sizes, so a lot of times they'll be used for headlines and more decorative kind of purposes. You're not going to see them in a lot of book copy and textbooks. You'll see them in bigger display kind of style, these modern typefaces. You might see them in logos, magazine covers, things like that. You might see type using this because it's a very nice looking font, but it doesn't work well at small sizes. Here's Dido is one that's fairly familiar, Bernhardt Modern, Bodoni, sometimes I say Bodini because a lot of these fonts are hard to pronounce. You see them one way and you never really hear them talked about. You don't put on a television show and hear people talking about certain fonts or anything like that. So a lot of them are mispronounced. But what you'll notice most about these typefaces is you won't see much of an angle of stress. They'll be pretty up and down. They'll be pretty straight, and then you'll also see very thin lines and very thick lines. So there'll be a lot of high contrast between these modern typefaces. Now, these fonts will be more precise and more mechanical than the old style or even the transitional. But what you'll see mostly between these fonts, and the one way you'll mostly recognize modern typefaces, is the high contrast between their lines. So if you see really high contrast, where even at small sizes here, the N, the thin lines, the thin strokes in the N, the secondary strokes are getting lost. So at small sizes, they almost break up. So I just want to point that out. That's a modern typeface. You won't use that a lot. Again, old style is kind of your workhorse that you would use out of those fonts. So we'll kind of look at serif fonts like old style and modern. We won't talk much about transitional. We won't talk much about humanist, but just be aware of what they are. And next there's Egyptian typeface. Now they have these listed under serif as well. I kind of treat Egyptian as slab serif, as a whole different category. Even though they are serifs, like a serif typeface, they usually have very square serif. Sometimes they're called square serif, sometimes they're called slab serif, and some of these fonts are more squarish than others. Matter of fact, Clarendon, the first one we see here, this is a bold version. It has very big serifs on it, but it could be very much like a Century school book, or even a Georgia that we see in Microsoft Word, used on the web and in PowerPoint a lot. And so it's a very subtle line between slab serif sometimes and regular serif, but the Clarendon is much more like a regular serif font. Now some of these are American Typewriter. Now this is used more as a decorative font to kind of look like a typewriter. It has very rounded edges on it. It's not really how a typewriter looks. It's more mimicking a typewriter look. So I don't know if I necessarily call it a slab serif. It does have the slabs on it. It's more of a monotype kind of serif if you look at it that way, but it's also used very decoratively. And speaking of monotype, Courier. Now, no one really designs with Courier anymore. That used to be the font that would show up on your computer when you'd have an error or something. When all other fonts would not work, you would see Courier. And back early 90s with computers, when you didn't have very many fonts, a lot of times they would print out in Courier. Word processors would use Courier. And Courier is actually a monospace font, and what that means, if you ever heard that term monospace, it means that like the letter I is almost the same width as all the other letters. It means they're almost all the same width. They take up the same amount of space. So if they were on like a letterpress, a little metal piece, all the letters would be the same size. So they're not really good for readability, but you can tell them apart. Like the letter I here, you don't have ones that are sometimes an L can look like a capital I and things like that, but the L and the I, they're very distinct of what they are, but no one's really designing with Courier anymore, unless you're maybe coding or something, but there's even better coding fonts to use than Courier. But they have them listed in here as an Egyptian or slab font. Now, ones you might be more familiar with, and then I'm more familiar with, are ones like Memphis, Rockwell. Some of these have very heavy fonts, which you might see on athletic wear, collegiate wear, sportswear, things like that for colleges. And so that's where you may encounter some of this with these big slabs. But also they originated from Victorian advertisements. They were used for display fonts. They were very decorative in nature and used as display fonts. And even today on the web, you'll see a lot of slab serif fonts kind of coming back. They weren't used maybe 5 years ago, but now you're seeing a lot of slab serifs being used as very decorative headlines on a lot of websites. So they're very nice in large sizes. It's not a body copy font, so it's not very readable because of the large slabs on them for body copy fonts, but they do work nice as headline fonts, and we'll use some of them, and there's all different weights, there's all different widths, meaning some can be more condensed, some can be more expanded, but they're becoming more of a flexible font than they used to be. So you'll see a little bit more of that on the web. There's a lot more modern slab serif fonts that you'll see, and we have a lot of those in our web fonts, even in Gravit. So that's the slab serif or Egyptian category, as they call it. And then finally we get to sans serif. Now sans serif, you're familiar with sans serif, that means without serifs. They don't have the serifs like the serif fonts. Now they have three categories of these. They have grotesque, because originally they were considered ugly. They weren't very stylish compared to the serif font, especially for readability, but they were very workmanlike, and they still are. These are the fonts you'll see on street signs and anywhere that you need very high readability at small sizes and from far away, you'll see sans serif fonts. Now the three categories, they're kind of subtle here, but the three categories of fonts, like I said, is grotesque, the first one, geometric, and then humanist. Now, I didn't put the whole other graphic that's usually on here because all that you need to know is just by looking at these letters. The A has a squared off apex. The small a is what they call a double story A. And as I refer to it, with the Fred Flintstone car roof on it for those A's, you can see that one has it and that one has it. It's really called a double-storied A, but I call it the Fred Flintstone roof as far as that. This A, you can see it's just like an A the way you would draw it, you know, with a circle and a line through it. This is more geometric. And the way to remember it, I don't know if you have to remember the word grotesque, but if you remember geometric, they have kind of geometric shapes. The letters have like circles and squares. They're very geometric in nature. Even the P's and the G's and a lot of those letters have circular shapes in them. They're not, you know, this letter A, you couldn't mistake that letter A for that letter A. Also, they have the apex at the top is in a point. That's another thing you'll see with geometric fonts. So as you look at these, this one is a geometric font. Futura is a very common geometric font. You can see the G's, the O's, they're very circular. Avant-garde, which isn't shown here, is a geometric font, and some of them even have geometric in the name. One thing to point out, because they're a little more unique in their nature. They don't mix well with other fonts, meaning whereas Helvetica might match nicely with a serif font, some of these other ones don't because they're a little more stylistic and they just don't match nice. But on the plus side, just like I'm showing here with Futura, they have usually nice families of fonts where they have very light fonts and very heavy fonts. So there's very high contrast. So you could design something that just is using Futura and a number of weights of Futura. You don't have to mix it with other fonts. There's enough contrast between fonts. You can get contrast just from fonts in the same family, where you can't always get that with other fonts. You won't always get that with Helvetica or the serif fonts and things like that. You might use Helvetica as kind of an accent font to more of a decorative font. But with these, they usually work better on their own. For the most part, it all depends on the font, but they're a little more decorative. You could see some of these here. This one is considered a Humanist because remember, Humanist looks a little more stylistic, a little more handwriting-ish. So you'll see some characters which, you might have a slight contrast in the lines. Actually, this one here, Optima, almost has thick, thin contrast, just like a serif font, although it doesn't really have serifs. Although if you look really close, which you're not going to see it when I do it here, they almost have little cups at the end. They're not really serifs, but they kind of cup at the ends of their letters. It's a very unique font. Again, it doesn't mix well with other fonts. The more unique a font is, the less it's going to mix with other font. Something like Helvetica will mix nicely with other fonts. It's very generic. One thing to point out about Helvetica, sometimes it's very hard to identify, and it looks very much like Universe. You'll see Universe at the beginning of the sans serif fonts. Universe has been around for a long time too. But Helvetica has this R where it kind of comes like it's going to be a letter B. It starts to go straight down and then it flares out at the end. So it's a very unique R. And Arial and some of the other fonts and Franklin Gothic and all those, they don't have that. So Helvetica is very unique. If you ever need to know if it's Helvetica, you need to look and see if it has that R that kind of comes down and flares out just very slightly at the end. It doesn't have a leg that sticks out like some of these other ones, or a leg that kind of comes out where the bowl ends, where the bowl kind of meets the stroke. It doesn't work like that. It kind of has the leg coming straight out from the top, almost like a letter B, almost like you're just chopping off where a letter B would continue and then just going down and flaring out. Also, other characteristics that they're pointing out here is Humanists have this like loop here. I think they called it a two-story G, but we know it as a loop. So if it has a loop, that's going to be in the Humanist subcategory of sans serif. Otherwise, they just have the regular tail, kind of the left-facing tail here on the Gs that you'll see. Also on the capital Gs, the only one that looks like it has a spur, the Helvetica, it has the spur, the goatee thing that I talked about. There's a spur there, so that's one of the characteristics as well. And usually they're very uniform in width. Usually they don't have any thick, thin width. Humanist does slightly, but most sans serifs are pretty much uniform in their width all the way around. Not completely. There'll be some thin areas, even in the letter A, as you kind of roll over the bowl here in the A before it reaches like the top hood of this letter A here. I don't even know if I'm using the right term of just the A, but you know what I'm talking about. There's the counter here, and as it goes along the top of the counter, you can see it gets a little bit thinner. So there's some variation, but usually they're very uniform. That's why they're very easy to read from far away. That's why you'll see a lot of sans serifs on street signs, on highway signs, on billboards, on small print, on packaging, everything that you could read at small sizes, and typically their X height's going to be very high too, which that helps their readability. So that's the sans serif category, and we'll talk about mixing them with other fonts, but these are kind of the subcategories just to give you an idea. But one thing just to point out of these categories, the grotesque are the ones that'll play well with other fonts and other categories of fonts, because typically you don't want to mix fonts from the same category. You never want to mix any of these together. You never want to mix a sans serif together or mix a serif together. You always want to mix them with another category of font. But like I said, some of these don't mix well with other fonts because they have characteristics of a serif font. So if you mix it with a serif font, they kind of clash a little bit. So just be careful of that. If you're looking for a font to mix well with other ones, stick to the grotesque fonts, the ones that have a flat top, that have the G going to the left, the tail going to the left. They may have a spur on them. They may not have a spur. But I think Franklin Gothic may have a slight spur on its G. Franklin Gothic is a nice one that mixes well with other fonts. So I just want to point that out about serif fonts. And then other categories, just to finish off here, script. There's not a lot to say to script other than we pretty much have formal script and casual script. And you could tell which ones are formal and casual. This one is casual. You'll see this on pizza places, a lot of Italian restaurants, they use this. You've seen brush script forever. It gets overdone, and the problem is people use them in all caps, and that makes it really hard to read. You might see this font even on sportswear and things like that, like baseball uniforms. You might see this kind of scripty, kind of casual font. This is a casual font that's unusual because it has no real angle to it. It has no real angle like an italic or oblique kind of movement to it. It's straight up and down. It's still very painterly. This is very painterly. These are painterly. These look more kind of done with a fine pen. This is very up and down angle. This has a very straight up and down angle. There's no italic going on here other than it is still curled. And it does have thick and thin lines. So I don't want to say angle of stress because there is going to be an angle of stress as you zoom in because there's thick and thin lines and weights on these characters. But this, I would say, is a formal. This is casual. This is almost like an architect kind of font that you might see. And this is in the category because it looks handwritten. So that's why we always put handwritten in with script. So this looks something handwritten you might see on blueprints or something like that, something like Tecton. And that's it. I didn't put decorative fonts on here because I think you'll know decorative fonts when you see them. I didn't need to put any characteristics because they have all different characteristics. Just like script typefaces, I don't have characteristics here except for the fact that sometimes they connect, sometimes they don't connect. Sometimes they look painterly, sometimes they don't. But you kind of know them when you see them, that they're either kind of formal, like a formal invitation, or more of a casual kind of look. And you'll know script fonts when you see them, and you'll know decorative fonts when you see them. They can be very novelty type fonts, they could be very bold, very unique. You'll see them on packaging, on headlines, on logos. But I didn't feel the need to make another page here that has decorative fonts. You'll know them when you see them. So that's kind of our categories of fonts. If you want to know more about categories of fonts, other than what you're reading in here, you could certainly read a lot in here. But even in this My Font Things, if you just go through here and look at some of the fonts, you'll see lots of fonts in here by Monotype. That's a commercial foundry, so you'll see all kinds of fonts. They're not going to be free necessarily in here, but you could look through these, and I'll have you look through these too to help find fonts because there's, thousands of fonts in here to look at. So these are the main categories, and I just wanted to go through the chapter to kind of break it down a little bit. You're going to be able to download this PDF, so hopefully it'll help you a little bit through this area of the categories because there's some weird kind of crossover here. They get in a lot more detail than you really need because I don't think you need to break it down to all these categories. But if you take a typography course at a four-year school or you take Typography 2, they might want you to know the difference between a Humanist and an old style and things like that. So at least you kind of have an idea, but I don't expect you to use that because when you're designing, you're not going to be thinking about that. It may be an afterthought, but you're not going to be thinking about that. So that's kind of your type classifications, and we're going to be talking about readability and legibility in the next chapter, which is a very important chapter to read through yourself. I don't know if I'll do a movie on it or not, but it's definitely some reading that you really need to do before we start designing. And in the end, what we're really going to be doing is designing. So now that we have some background on these fonts, hopefully we could start to use them together and start to do a little more design work with these.